the aspect of the responsibility of leaders and the care, particularly of leaders. I'm delighted now to welcome our next series of speakers with Andrew Whyte and Chris Woolard. I'm delighted to welcome you both to the stage. A little bit of background about Andrew. Again, you have both our speakers' bio on the program. Andrew is our advisory board member. He's also a wonderful client we very much enjoyed working with at the FCA when he was head of communications. And what's not on Andrew's bio, in addition to all the amazing roles he's had in public service in this country, is also that Andrew is going to be starting as chief executive of the Association of Financial Mutuals. Make sure I get that right. So Andrew, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And Chris Woolard, thank you.
Thank you, Sandra, and good afternoon, everyone. As Sandra says, my name's Andrew Whyte, and I'm proud to be a member of the ECHO Advisory Board, and I'm going to be kind of talking to Chris Woolard about some of the challenges of regulation, which we've already heard is a kind of a theme that's emerging in some of the research that ECHO's been doing. Chris is a great person to talk about this because he is chair of the EY Global Regulatory Network. He leads EY's EMEA and UK Financial Services Regulation Practice and their UK FinTech work. But before he joined EY last year and brought in that expertise of regulation, he had a 25-year career in UK public service, including a large chunk in regulation and regulatory roles. He held senior roles at the BBC's then regulator, the BBC Trust, before going on to Ofcom, the media and communications regulator, which Mike has clearly got views about, before joining the FCA Financial Conduct Authority in 2013. At the FCA, Chris served as Executive Director of Strategy and Competition, a member of the FCA's board, and crucially and pertinently for some of our discussions this afternoon, as Interim Chief Executive during the first phase of the pandemic in 2020. And full disclosure, a little bit like Neil's just done, Chris was my boss at the FCA, but since he no longer does my annual appraisals, I promised to go easy on the brown nosing. One of the themes of this conference is about the theme of the conference is about balancing conflicting priorities in the face of change. And that's particularly relevant for regulation. And as I say in Sandra's eloquent introduction, we saw regulation emerging as a theme on people's agendas at the moment. And of course, the last few years have been characterised by change, the most dramatic of which was the pandemic. So I'm going to start with that and start to talk to Chris a bit about our experience of regulating through the pandemic. And Chris, I'm going to ask you to cast your mind back, nearly 3 years now. Andrew Bailey, who Sandra name-checked earlier, was appointed as Governor of the Bank of England in December 2019. You were appointed as Interim CEO about a month later, in late January. And meanwhile, in China, the world was starting to change. You formally took up your post on the 16th of March. As a comms director, I knew all these dates, by the way, I've done. And the first lockdown began on the 23rd of March. So it was pretty clear very early on that this wasn't going to be the usual tenure of an interim CEO. But I just want to ask you, when did you identify, once you'd taken up the post, that regulatory interventions by the FCA would become part of the wider, the non-health, if you like, that was the front line, but we at the FCA were involved in this wider response across society to the pandemic? And when did you recognise that? And what were some of the triggers that made you realise that was what we were going to have to intervene in that way?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So I think it's fair to say the planning for what we were about to go into at the start of the pandemic started sort of really around the time I'd actually was announced as being appointed, and simultaneously with the news that was coming out of China. And perhaps predictably, where we were working with government and where we were working with others, you immediately go for the tools that you know. So government very much planning around a health emergency, lots of organisations, including the FCA, bearing in mind we had 4,000 people working for the organisation, thinking about how are we going to cope with very large numbers of people who may be sick. And a lot of that internal planning really around how do we keep operating at a time where we balance those things. So how do we split teams and so on and so forth. For us as a financial regulator, also starting to plan around the idea that we could have a very, very large economic shock to the economy that was very difficult to predict, and therefore very large numbers of insolvencies, for example. So we started to pull out of the bag the kinds of tools that financial regulators have used in previous economic shocks. But I think very, very rapidly, and certainly actually the week I took up post, it really kind of snapped home to me, getting a call just before midnight from my sort of European level opposite number, saying that a number of stock exchanges across Europe were starting to think about suspending in the next 24 hours because of the uncertainty and because of the volatility. And that's not an uncommon phenomenon. It's not something that we're used to much in the UK. The idea of suspending the LSE would be a very big event indeed. But on many of the smaller sort of bourses across Europe, that is a fairly common regulatory tactic. But just being confronted by the sheer numbers who were thinking about this really begins to tell you this is something very, very different that you're dealing with. And at that point, we still weren't into an official sense of lockdown, but it was becoming very, very clear that this is going to be unlike anything really any series of societies had dealt with before. And so I think you're forced to then start to regulate in very different ways. I mean, the first is you have to have a massive dose of pragmatism. If we're looking at a world in which most of the operations that we know are suddenly going to try and start to work from home, which we all take for granted now, but at the time that was really completely untested. Everyone had a disaster recovery based on one or two buildings maybe being bombed or something, but not an entire economy going to work from home. How do you make that operate? How do you think about recordings and all the things that financial regulators require? Secondly, just the sheer scale of who was going to get hit. Think about millions of people unable to afford their mortgages. And in the middle of a pandemic where staying at home with a roof over your head was incredibly important. And so you end up in a mode where you've got to think of those solutions very, very quickly. And I think there's a couple of things that regulators will look for, and certainly I felt very, very conscious about. So, I mean, I think the first of those was the way in which we work had to change very rapidly. So for those of you used to dealing with financial regulators, if you want something done, it's about a 9-month cycle. We go out, we consult, we possibly change rules, we then expect people to implement them. And instead, we move to a mode of working where those kind of rule changes were achieved sometimes in sort of 2 or 3 days. The way of doing that often was to get the CEOs of major banks or major insurers all on the phone together very quickly, regroup within 24 hours, look at what the art of the possible might be. And probably the biggest early change we obviously had was the mortgage rules. So 5 million people got to stay in their homes because they could renegotiate their mortgage automatically, effectively. But then also, I suppose, one final thing is the expectations on the regulators at that point, and the expectations on the official sector, if you like, at that point, is although lots of people are willing to do the right thing, although business as a whole wants to help at that moment, they also want to know there's a bit of a level playing field. They do want some leadership. The Treasury, in our case, could absolutely not deal with everything. And so you have to construct a narrative, which really is, and given this is a communications conference after all, you absolutely have to construct a narrative at that point to try to explain to people what's going on. And although no one knows how this is going to play out medically, we have to be able to give people something to aim for. So we had this idea of we're creating a bridge, and all of our actions are geared around trying to create this bridge from one side of an emergency to the other. And that became something that I think a lot of people clung to as a narrative far more than I expected they would, which began to give us the basis of a way forward.
Building on that a bit, the FCA has a number of statutory responsibilities, consumer protection, market integrity, and promoting competition in the interest of consumers. There are some commentators who see, again, the theme of the day, if not a conflict, then at least a tension between these three objectives. faced with those challenges that you've just outlined, and how did you go about, what approach did you take to balance those different priorities? What did you think about getting that right balance right?
I think if you take the bridge analogy that we used, as I said, a lot of that is about saying, look, we want to be able to preserve as much of the market and avoid as much of the economic damage as we possibly can from the situation we're going into to the one we help try and take people out of. And I think in that world, although you might take a range of very different actions, they do speak to all of those priorities ultimately. So in asking, for example, banks to do things largely voluntarily, frankly, about how they treated their mortgage borrowers, that might be seen as a consumer protection measure, and it absolutely was. But it was also about how, when things improve here, and how as people go back to work, particularly if they're self-employed, as the economy begins to recover, how do you make that as least disruptive to the business model of those institutions as you possibly can? And so how do you think about market integrity in those situations? And the reality is, I mean, certainly in the first month of the crisis, all sorts of things that you took for granted about the operation of financial markets started to come out the woodwork as being broken. I mean, I remember one Sunday afternoon having to try and fix how we think financial reporting is going to work in a pandemic, or otherwise on Monday morning there was a whole series of results due for financial firms where all the auditors could do was qualify the accounts because they couldn't get onto the premises, et cetera, et cetera. And talking about that now, it sounds trivial in some respects, but I mean the effects on those companies in what was a very volatile environment would have been really serious and probably have done them some lasting damage, or at least some medium-term damage, which was completely avoidable. But you have to be prepared, I think, just to be incredibly pragmatic when you're in that situation and you are there on behalf of, you know, the official sector as a whole.
So, recognising that that was a kind of a unique situation, well, let's hope it's a unique situation anyway. But when you look back on that time, are there any wider lessons, and particularly in the context of your current role with that global overview you have, are there any wider lessons about the role of regulation and the practical implementation of regulatory policy which could apply outside a pandemic context? I mean, and maybe even picking up some of the things that Mike was talking about a few moments ago, things we could think about applying in terms of dealing with the current situation, and particularly things like the cost of living crisis.
Yeah, I mean, the two things really, I think, come out of that for me. I know you're always meant to have a list of three. Apologies, Khaled. But two really big lessons from that situation for me. I mean, the first is, I think often the dialogue between regulators and those they regulate, and indeed the consumer groups who represent those who use the products that are being regulated, is often very stylised. And it's often very stylised for good reason. There are lots of legal rules around how you consult and all of those sorts of things. But I think often you can have quite a sort of atrophied kind of conversation going on, which follows certain rules and follows certain conventions. Whereas actually during the pandemic, I think we had meetings where real work was being done between all the different parties. We have a problem, how are we going to solve it? And I think quite often regulators feel forced to come to the table saying, we have a problem, we've also worked out what we think the solution is, now tell us if that solution doesn't work. That starts the conversation in a very, very different place rather than a more open dialogue. And then the second piece for me is the degree to which, just building on that first point, often the need is to come forward with a solution rather than necessarily calling out the problem. And I think on something like cost of living, being really explicit about, look, these are the issues we need to try and solve for, rather than simply, I've got a bunch of answers, I'm taking some action, how could, job done, I think is really, really important. But I think back to actually a point that Mike was making, I think the interaction, particularly with the press around that, is really difficult, even for regulators, because you're the regulator, who's been arrested, what change in policy is about to happen, what action's been taken, That's what people want to hear, as opposed to saying, look, we're in the middle of something that is genuinely complex, and this is going to need a whole series of different parties to try and make it work. That just sounds like I'm kicking the can down the road, and it's how do you change some of that dialogue.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to move on from the pandemic now and look at some of the kind of current issues. I mean, particularly the growth agenda, which has been on everybody's lips. I mean, it's a commonplace amongst some commentators that regulation is antithetical to, or at least a brake on, competitiveness and growth, and especially innovation. We heard that a lot, I think, as Mike has hinted at earlier, since Brexit, especially in recent months, in the kind of post-summer period. And only last week, the Prime Minister, in his speech at the CBI conference, highlighted the importance of innovation as the key to growth as he saw it. Interestingly, though, I think some of ECHO's own research shows that actually a well-regulated market is actually trusted both by consumers and indeed by investors. And I think you've only got to look at crypto in the current topical example and healthcare in Africa to see where there are issues around that. And as for innovation, I think it's widely accepted that the UK's regulatory environment has contributed to its global lead in fintech. And sparing your blushes, probably more than anyone, you drove and shaped the regulatory framework for fintech in the early part of the last decade. Can you tell us what you saw as the opportunity, and how you went about striking that balance in terms of innovation and growth, but also making sure those other objectives of the FCA's were met?
That's firstly very kind of you to say it that way. I mean, I think it's a lesson here. So back to back, actually, something Mike said earlier on. He said, look, history repeats itself. So rather than talk about cutting-edge cryptography and all those sort of things for a second, let's just go back to the England of Alfred the Great. Okay? Vikings invading, the world's in chaos, the country's in ruins. And what Alfred actually did was establish the system of burhs. So where most of our towns to this day exist, they exist on the site of ancient burhs. And this has got a point to it, by the way. Bear with me. Right? In those burhs, you had the only person ever named in a medieval document of the time who wasn't a lord or wasn't a king. And that was a person called the Portreeve. And the Portreeve was basically what we take nowadays as regulators and government all rolled into one person. And he made sure that the walls were safe, that the Vikings couldn't get over them. He made sure that inside only the market could be held there. If you went to the market, you got fair measure. And he also made sure that the taxes were connected for the king, so he could raise an army and beat the Vikings in that world. Right? And if you go around the world, if you go to China 2,000 years earlier, virtually the same rules and laws written down. Exactly the same purpose. And this idea of you create somewhere where there's a market, where it's got some rules around it, where you get treated fairly if you're a customer of that market, and ultimately the state benefits in the form of taxation from that market and then applies it to whatever the big issues of the day are. Hundreds of examples like that all around the world. And yet somehow, I think in the modern political dialogue, we've completely forgotten that lesson. And so when you approach potential growth, I mean, I think regulation can have a really, really important role. And that's about giving customers that certainty and that protection and that confidence to engage in something that is potentially new and not well understood. That's the first piece. Second piece is, without that competition, we know that markets become stale and settled. They tend towards monopoly. There's a lack of competition between players. Even if there isn't that monopoly, why is it in anyone's interest to rock the boat and do something new if everybody is doing well from that market? And again, we see that repeated across the world in different economic patterns. And so the idea really from, that we struck out with the FCA was to say, let's try and get around that problem in a couple of ways. The first is we're concentrating only on innovation that is in the interest of consumers. There's a lot of innovation that happens in financial markets that is in no one's interest except the innovators, and that is not good. That always ends in tears. The second thing is, how do you create a space where And it's quite unusual, actually. And so if you think about modern regulation, you think about modern sort of political dialogue, you create a space where people can actually try and fail safely. And that's what the whole concept around the regulator having a sandbox was about. Come in, 6 months, you can trial a product, you can actually do it out there in the real world. That model's now been copied in over 50 countries around the world. The UK was the first to do it. And the big benefit is clearly you get innovation that clearly is meant to be out there in the market and will actually give a useful product, an economically useful product to society. But it also has some really interesting side benefits, which is if you're one of those fintechs, if you're one of those innovative firms and you've been through that process, guess what? Kel surprise. It is far, far easier for them to get venture capital funding, private equity funding, because they can go to the market and say, look, I've got something here. It's a model that's tried and tested. And I think all too often we think of regulation as simply holding things back. And that's often because I think the dialogue around it is the dialogue between the big incumbents who are very happy to keep things the way they are and the government and the regulators, and where new regulation is seen as unhelpful, versus actually where it can bring new people into the market. But the one final thing I would say, and this is some of Mike's earlier criticisms of regulators, there is an element of truth to this as well. I mean, regulation can be a great force for good. It can also completely stifle things, and it can have unintended consequences. And so it's how do you keep that wider dialogue going? How do you keep your ears open as a regulator about how you might need to change things and when you don't, frankly, get it right?
So it's a good point. Just to move on a bit from that, think about keeping your eyes and ears open as a regulator. The context of today's discussion, which set out so eloquently by Sandra earlier on, is about the kind of seismic changes of the last few years and their kind of ripple effect forward. We're thinking about things like the economic recovery after the pandemic, the cost of living crisis we've already mentioned, the ESG agenda, which is driven in large by to a large degree at least, by the whole kind of global challenge of climate change, and especially in the last few months, the quite extraordinary geopolitical situation that we're living through at the moment. All of this creates an incredibly volatile, uncertain and complex environment for all of us, regulators included. You now sit chairing the EY Global Practice with this overview globally of regulation and regulatory policy. What do you think is going to happen in the context of that to regulation and regulatory policy and regulatory practice?
I think that probably is the more than $1 million question, but for me, there are three things that I think are going to shape how that regulatory landscape looks over the next few years. I mean, the first is a geopolitical piece you've already mentioned, but I'll come back to that in a second. I think the second theme is data and digitisation, and in particular, how do regulators begin to react to that? And then I think the third big piece is ESG, and in particular, how do the climate pieces and the green financing pieces of that manifest themselves. But I think on the geopolitical piece, I mean, I think everyone can very quickly and rapidly point at what's happened in Ukraine, the tensions around Taiwan between the US and China, and the much deeper tensions between the US and China. And then I think you can go on to the next level beyond that. You can talk about, grain supply from Russia and Ukraine into sub-Saharan Africa. You can think about, some of the other knock-on effects if we do see disruption in the Gulf in terms of oil supply, where suddenly I think the US will begin to understand some of the inflationary pressures around energy that Europe's already experienced. So you can get all of those sort of things. But I think the interesting piece from my perspective, and certainly from the clients that I deal with, is what are the knock-on consequences? So I think there's a couple of things. I mean, the first is regulation has always been fragmented. Even though bodies like IOSCO and the FSB exist in financial services, or there are other UN-sponsored bodies in other parts of the world, the reality is the big trading blocs around the world tend to set a version of their own rules and always have done. I think what we're seeing, though, at the moment is a much deeper phenomenon around that. So not just accounting rules in the US that are very clearly targeted at China, but if you look at India, their data rules, which are really more about how do they build an independent financial sector separate to China, but have all sorts of knock-on consequences. So, firms like American Express and MasterCard really running foul of that approach. And even, bluntly, within countries. In the US, the policies that are being adopted by some states, so say California versus Texas, are very, very different. And then you get the market reaction to that. So, one of the things I think we can all see is people strategically not decoupling from China, not that far, but actually a sense of their strategies towards China cooling a bit. I think many firms are now having to say we've survived for years by being sort of neutral about politics, and actually we're being increasingly forced at national level to pick a side. And does that mean now instead of being in 40 or 50 countries around the world, we can only really successfully be, say, in 20 or 30? And I think those decisions are starting to become real. On the data and the digitisation piece, I think even if some regulators around the world tried to get as close to the edge of this as they could, the reality is regulation is playing catch up, and there are all sorts of considerations around artificial intelligence, around ethics, where I think there's a whole series of things to come that firms need to begin to plan for now. And then finally on the ESG piece, there's a lot of conversation about this. I think in reality, certainly again, if I look into our client base, maybe 50% of firms max have really begun to engage with the commerciality of it as opposed to the positioning of it. And I think how that begins to manifest itself and how in particular, is it a climate-led conversation, or is it, certainly in the financial world, a more finance-led conversation? So how do we deal with things like transition finance, where you've got polluting industries today, and are they going to be funded as green because they're moving to a much greener future? Those kind of dividing issues mean that I think that point is really all still to play for there. And again, I think how regulators begin to approach this, and certainly at the moment it still feels very, very fragmented, is going to have a massive effect on the market, and in particular, where does the US go within that? So 3 big things. There are lots of others, but I think 3 big things that really will shape how we all think about regulation in the future.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I think that's a good point to open to the floor. Right, hands up straight away. So just straight here. Yes, in the second row. Yes, you. Yeah, the mic's coming down now. So say who you are and ask your question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Cindy Yendall from Leonardo Advisory, Culture Change Business. Christopher, I was really interested to listen to how you responded, or how your team responded during the pandemic to the crisis, and the fact that actually you became very purposeful. There seemed a really immediate purpose, which Mike was talking about earlier, which is super important. And the fact that you changed the way that you're working quite quickly overnight. So collaborating with the banks, building teams of trust, making decisions really quickly, being really productive. That's what I heard you saying. And a lot of my clients behaved the same way during that crisis. Many of them have slipped back to old ways of working. And actually, so my question to you is twofold, really. Is one, did you hold on to some of those new ways of working? Because essentially that was about a shift in culture, a shift in the way that you worked with stakeholders. So did you hold on to much of that really positive new ways of working, or did you slip back? And yes, that's my question, really.
Okay. So, I think there's 2 parts to that story, internally and externally. So I didn't really sort of talk about it much in my answer previously, but internally we did change very, very rapidly. So you need to be in a situation, and I think many firms experience this, where you shorten dramatically your internal lines of communication. So one of the things I started to do almost by accident was a weekly newsletter. I wrote it. Andrew sadly didn't write it. I literally wrote it myself. It was what I wanted to say to the organisation internally, and try to create the similar sort of bridge narrative for the people inside the organisation. In terms of our formal decision making, we had a sort of crisis group, which was not just our exco, but some of the other directors as well, to give our teams far more chance in an uncertain world of knowing enough to make their own decisions quickly on the ground, rather than everything being referred up. And I think certainly that latter piece and certainly the weekly communication I held on to once we were still feeling like we could catch our breath. I think there's other things where you begin to slip back a little bit. I mean, that amazing rapid decision making, and I can remember a particularly terrible moment where it was 3 a.m. and we were announcing to the market at 7 a.m. the next day and getting to a decision and then going, Andrew, can you write a press release? Here we go. Not many people want to keep working like that, and it's not sustainable. So you do slip back in slightly older ways. But I hope, certainly during my tenure, and, I had to step down after 6 months because Rishi Sunak, who was Chancellor at the time, decided it was going to be someone else other than me. But I hope during my tenure we kept some of that. But I do think it's very easy and comfortable to be able to say, right, we're out of crisis, let's all relax. How did we used to do this stuff? And I think that is a real temptation to slip back into that space.
So down here, I think.
Kai Peters from Coventry University. Christopher, some years ago, I went to see, I think it was the FSA before it was the FCA, and I was asking how it worked and how many inspectors there were and how many players in the market there were. And people were telling me, we're doing stuff in teams now, but the ratio didn't strike me as very good. So I was asking whether data and tech was being used properly by regulators, and were they using big data and artificial intelligence and tracking social media opinions on the payday lender or the mortgage provider. And I got looked at like I was coming from the moon. And I'd just be interested in your view on whether regulators are actually up to date on stuff they're supposed to be using or regulating, as it were.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll comment on sort of my day, as it were, and then sort of the last couple of years in terms of what I can observe more globally. So one of the things we absolutely did, and I wrote, I think it was the FCA's first data strategy, was how do you harness some of the things you've just talked about? So how do we use social media on a consistent basis to actually monitor what we think customers are getting? How do we use some very large data sets to spot outliers? And we began to do that from a supervisory point of view. I mean, during this crisis period, no one had experienced trying to shut down pretty much every economy in the world before. And so, I mean, it did feel, there are various analogies that people use. Some people said it was like Captain Cook getting past Malaysia and then not having a chart, or, flying a plane without the instruments working, or whatever it might be. And we did have to find proxies very, very quickly, both in the FCA and the Bank of England. And so there were things we were using that came absolutely from big data. So, Google, it turns out, is an absolutely fantastic way of getting analytics on traffic information. We were using spending data and spending pattern changes from most of the large car providers and things like that, where actually you can see a pattern of how a country goes into a lockdown and how people's habits change, and essentially they're the same anywhere in the world. And the fact that there were some countries ahead of the UK became an incredibly important tool for us, because we could kind of see what was happening to them and say, we're probably going to be at that stage of the curve in 4 weeks' time. But yeah, I mean, since then, I think the FCA's doubled down on that wider data strategy, and I think we'll hopefully see some proof of that. I think when you go around the world, it varies considerably. So, jurisdictions like Singapore, I think, are incredibly advanced about how they're using some of these tools. The US regulators are getting there, but often hampered by the fact that their own internal boundaries mean they're very fragmented about how they think about big data. And then I think there's some, certainly from an EY perspective, we're part of some very interesting experiments that are happening in different parts of the Far East and different parts of the Middle East, for example. So I think regulators are getting there is probably the short answer. But, there's an awful lot of space and ground to still try and cover.
One more question, I think. Just there, thanks.
Charles Tilley, the IRCC. Christopher, if we just stick with the UK rather than the global piece, and Mike was talking about the regulators getting in the way of innovation, but your story on King Alfred and the Vikings, which I thought was brilliant, was very much about regulation being a builder of trust, and therefore very important in terms of the market. where are we today in the UK in terms of where's the dead wood, if you like, and what's getting in the way of innovation, or is it all perfect?
No. So look, I mean, if I talk about this maybe from my perspective at EY for a second, I mean, there are bits of the system that are not working well at the moment. So the system by which we authorise new companies to come into the market, new individuals to be senior individuals, that for a variety of reasons seems to have been very, very seriously challenged in the last 2 years. And therefore, that creates a significant delay for new business and innovation in the market. The regulators are still clearly grappling with some of the effects of Brexit that we've already touched on earlier on, from a very practical point of view. So how do you facilitate firms doing cross-border business? How do you reauthorise many of the people who have previously been in the UK under EU passports for firms and those sorts of things? So there's some really practical sort of sludgy things going on. There is a fine line, I think, to walk on trust, and I often got confronted with this as a regulator, which is the industry saying, well, you keep fining us and you keep giving us bad PR. If only you didn't fine us and we didn't have the bad PR, then people would trust us. And I think that's I'm only slightly paraphrasing. Trust, I think, for most people. I mean, Mark Carney once said, it arrives on foot and it departs in a Ferrari. But trust really is about giving people the sense of, certainly in financial services, I can borrow money here, I can invest money here, I can do all the things I need to do to survive as an individual financially, and that if something goes wrong, I know there is a system that will look after me, essentially. I mean, I think that's really where trust comes down to. And so it is about how firms tackle that head on. I think that the consumer duty in the UK is causing a whole series of firms to think really, really deeply and fundamentally how do they deal particularly with all new retail consumers. I think that's really, really important. I think, though, regulation also, to some extent, has taken a slightly more cautious path in recent years and does need to think about, where it takes a risk. I mean, I think a lot of the work we did around the sandbox and a lot of the work that we did around fintech in the early days was a risk, because we knew something would go wrong at some point, and it would go wrong with a regulator's label on it at that point. It's far easier if you're a regulator to sort of put the walls up, as you've seen in a number of countries, not engage, and just say it's the Wild West over there. And I think crypto's the very best example of saying it's the Wild West over there. And I think one of the questions, really, I think if we want further innovation in financial markets, and its innovation in the interest of consumers, is how far do we want the UK to be ahead of a number of other countries in sort of reaching into that space, and how far are we sort of happy to kind of stay back in the pack? And, that's decisions for others these days rather than obviously me.
Chris, thank you very much. I'm afraid we're out of time for that session, but thank you for that kind of toured our eyes on of regulation, starting with one of the most acute crises that a regulator could ever face, and the details of how we dealt with it, how we responded to it under your leadership, through to your kind of overview of the global trends and the global patterns and the pressures that are on regulators, not just in the UK, but around the world, all of which fits very neatly and segues into the presentation that Sandra gave us earlier on about some of the challenges we're facing. So it's been a really excellent way to take the discussion forward. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.